stay awake this afternoon. So let's the obstacle opportunity. What I loved, I heard a phrase recently, which is give negativity a role. When we focus on the negatives, the difficult bits, it allows our brain to process in a slightly different way, and it allows us to come up with ideas. And where there are opportunity, where there's difficulty, there's definitely opportunity. I don't know. Does anyone know the story behind the original Rocky, about how Sylvester Stallone got the original Rocky to where it was and became a star? I don't know if you've heard this story, but it's actually an incredible story. So basically, Sylvester Stallone wrote Rocky. He wanted to be a famous actor, so he kept pitching himself as an actor. Didn't get any traction, so he wrote the screenplay Rocky, and then he said, "Right, I play Rocky." And he pitched this film, and he had numerous big offers and bearing in mind he was a broke guy from the Italian part of New York. I can't remember what that was called, but he was a broke guy to the point where he actually sold his dog, the one thing that he loved most, because he was down to his last pennies. He sold the dog, and he was getting offered good money for the Rocky script. They refused it because they were offering it to him. They were actually at one stage said, "We're going to pay you more money than we offered, as long as but you can't be in it." He was like, "No, I'm absolutely. You only get Rocky if I am playing Rocky," and he stuck with it. He took a fraction of the money he'd been offered, but that was what got him to be Rocky. He went back to the guy, bought his dog back. I can't remember what the numbers were, but he paid like 100 times what he'd sold the dog, because the guy was just totally rinsing him. But got the dog back. But if you hear, there's a good documentary called Sly that talks a little bit about this story. I've heard it from a few different sources. But it is about overcoming those obstacles and achieving our goals through that. Has anyone seen Ali? This is a great film. I really, really like this, and I'd forgotten that this film existed. I didn't see it when it came out, but it's a really good film. And Muhammad Ali was famous, wasn't he? Because for lots of reasons, but one of the things was in an interview they said, "How many press-ups can you do?" And he said 9, and they went, "You can do 9 press-ups?" He said, "Yeah. When I get to the point where I think I can't do another press-up, I can do 9." And so he always did 9 beyond what he thought was his maximum. But in the film, I love the part where he's about to go into the rumble in the jungle, and that is Evander Holyfield, I think, isn't it? Is he fighting Evander Holyfield? I think that's right. No, George Foreman. Sorry, George Foreman. Yes, and George Foreman is actually the favourite in this fight. And George Foreman is in the room, and Ali walks in the room, and he basically sees these bongo drums in the room, and he's just like, "The jump is here, the jump is here." And basically he creates this huge, like mentally, he's got a huge challenge to overcome, but in his mind, he is the champ. And the best person at that was Steve Jobs. So there is an interview with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and Bill Gates talks about it it might have been in Bill's brain, but he said, "I had to remember when we left the interview, because Steve Jobs was famous for creating this reality distortion field. In other words, he'd just talk about a concept, and reality just disappeared. He was just totally in his own world." And this interview was about Apple versus Microsoft, and Bill Gates said after the interview, "I had to go and remind myself at the end of the interview, I had to remind myself that Microsoft was worth 1,000 times more than Apple was." Like the way that interview had gone, Steve Jobs had convinced everyone that he was the big cheese in the room, whereas actually nothing compared to Microsoft at the time. So it's about overcoming obstacles, and within the obstacle is the way. It's a book about stoicism. I don't know if has anyone read that. It's kind of like there's some good stuff in there, but it got me thinking. Pardon? Yeah, the book. But one of the stories it did quote was a story about Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison, in the middle of his research, had a massive fire, and basically his whole empire burnt down. So this could be, this would be massively depressing if you think about in that day and age. Nothing was backed up or saved. And Thomas Edison could have gone into a massive depression when he heard about this. But instead, what he did was he invited his family to see the fire. And he said, and I'll quote, "You'll never see another fire like this. We just got rid of a load of rubbish." So he saw what was a massive challenge as an opportunity to go on and do something different. And in fact, if you read Pixar's the book about Pixar, which is Creativity Inc., there's a lovely story in there where they're about halfway through filming or creating Toy Story 2, and it got deleted. And basically the backup was months. So they lost like a year's worth of work in the creation of Toy Story 2. But, and that actually put doing Toy Story 2 at complete risk. And yet, as a result, they created a better film because of the obstacle it was created. We interviewed a lady called Michaela Jones, who was an Australian triathlete, very, very, very good triathlete. She talks a lot about controlling the controllables, which is, there's shit going on, but actually all I can focus on is this. And this is what we need to be thinking about, is when there's obstacles on our way, there's certain things that we can control and then certain things that we can't. So for example, Michaela, I can't remember which race it was, but she turned up to race an Ironman event, I think it was, and her bike didn't get brought in on the flight. So she had to she started the swim with no bike in transition, but she knew that it was out of her control. So she had I think it was her sister that was on the ground, desperately trying to get this bike from the airport, get it set up and into transition. She absolutely nailed the swim, but she didn't know until she got into transition 1 that the bike was even going to be there. She ended up winning that race because she knew that it was out of her control. If it was there, great, she'd have a chance of winning the race. If it wasn't, I can't control that. So we've got to think about how we control the controllables. And one of the things, so for those of you that have read Entrepreneurial Happiness at some point, at the end of it, I talk about my best mate from university who's no longer with us, Rob. So I was his best man. And when there's something difficult, and I think about this quite often when I'm in a long run or a long, tough, when there's something difficult, you can think, oh, why is this happening to me? But actually, there's a sentence that I love that I've heard a few people who I've interviewed use, which is, I get to do this. What would Rob give to get the opportunity to be able to, even if it is painful, even if it is difficult, we get to do this stuff. We're incredibly fortunate to be in the entrepreneurial position that we're in. And yes, it can be challenging, but actually we get to do this stuff. I get to do that. It is incredible. And it's such a good way of reframing something when you're going through a tough time, whether it's in sport or business. I get to do this, and I'm incredibly lucky that I get to do this. To stick with the triathlon theme, of which there's a few coming out today, one of the other ways to do this is to really chunk stuff down. So I interviewed Ruth Astle, who is a very good triathlete. So what she would do with an Ironman bike, you've got 112 miles. What she would do is she mentally would break that down into laps. So I'd never really thought about it before because naturally the course might give you 3 laps, but she would break it down into, let's say, 20-mile laps or 10-mile laps, and she just hit lap on her Garmin to go, right, I'm in a new lap. We said at the start, new start of any particular period of time is an opportunity for new focus. And in fact, the workout I was doing this morning, on my watt bike, I got 2 16-minute blocks at a power output that was above what's called my FTP. My FTP is what I should be able to sustain for 20 minutes. This was two 16-minute blocks at nearly 10 watts above my FTP. It was tough. My coach had said, break that down into four minutes. So I've still got to do the whole thing in one go, but I've chunked it down, and it is so much easier. And this is what we want, what we need to do when we're overcoming obstacles. Firstly, we need to know what the obstacle is. And one of the processes that I'll come back to when we talk about the annual goal setting process and the Limitless Life Planner is about chunking things down and understanding what because what we tend to do is we see one big goal as one big problem, but it isn't one big problem, is it? It's actually 10 smaller problems. And if we chunk that down in the same way that Ruth Astle is saying, I'm not seeing it as a 112-mile bike ride, I'm seeing it as 10, 12-mile bike rides. Each time, right, okay, what have I got to do for this 12 miles? I've just got to sustain this power, and then I've succeeded. And now I'm on to the next one. I've talked to you before about the run, walk, run strategy of running for 9 minutes, walking for 1 minute. That's chunked the marathon down into 26 chunks as opposed to one long run. This is what we do with obstacles.